choice of lemonade, sarsaparilla. Come on down, everybody. And beer and wine. Yeah.
Oh, how fun.
You don't want to drink at all?
This is only. That's right. Yeah, but it's got 16 years.
Oh, you did. Good.
What's up?
I'll take one too.
Maybe I should have a couple cupfuls before we get to
You're
Yeah, let's
good,
get all the
Sheriff.
drinks filled. So, who wants what? Beer, wine, lemonade, or sarsaparilla? And we do have another refill on top of Main Street.
I'll have wine.
All right, I'll do one. Yeah, we might as well just, since we're here, might as well just get all these people dealt with first. All right. Sarsaparilla, Aaron, go up there.
Beer is this kind.
More wine? Wine?
You wanted to try.
Anything else, wine?
You wine. Oh, there we go. We got another take. I'm like, let's go.
I wine all the time, but I'm not drinking.
Sarsaparilla, I think, going up to him, going up to the sheriff.
All
There
right.
you go. Sarsaparilla.
Sarsaparilla. Here we go.
Some wine?
Got it. I have no idea if this is carbonated or caffeinated or not.
Come on over this way, Sarah.
Have fun, kids.
There you go.
We'll find out.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, it is okay.
Any lemonade?
Take some lemonade.
Freshly squeezed. Get the sugar.
Jordan's going into fifth, but he thinks sarsaparilla. Beer, yeah.
You want lemonade or sarsaparilla?
Came right from a little stream somewhere. It's like Good evening, folks. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming out. Haven't seen you folks in these parts. You must be new to this area. Well, it looks like you got your drinks. That's fantastic. Now, I'm not much for public speaking, so I wrote some of this stuff down so I don't get it wrong. I hope you're okay with that. You've got your wine, you've got your beer, you've got your lemonade. Now, don't worry about walking around town with your beer or your wine. In 1889, Sundance was wide open. You could carry your favorite beverage anywhere you wanted around town. And in 2020, it hasn't changed. Still able to enjoy a stroll and a libation. Right. Now, right here next to us was the original Crook County Courthouse. That's where it stood, right here. This is it. Now, it was located where the current day courthouse stands. The courthouse was finished in 1887, the same year that Sundance was incorporated. At that time, the mail stage ran through Sundance going from Buffalo, Wyoming to Spearfish, South Dakota. It was kind of neat. Now, I need to point out, this is the jail, right here, where someone stayed for an amount of time, also known as the Kid. Let's see, we had about 515 people here in 1887, and we wanted to be a town long before now, but didn't have enough people. So, now in 2020, we count about 1,100. Is that still right, Rocky? Yeah, about 1,100. About 12? Yep. Man, we're cooking. We're going to be a metropolis real soon.
Population explosion.
Yeah, seriously. The spill of beans right here now about the most interesting arrest of my career, because I am Sheriff Jim Ryan, in case anybody didn't know. I'm the law here in Crook County. I'm talking about when I arrested Harry Longabout, later known as the Sundance Kid, because he did some time right here in a brand new jail. Now, before I go any further, I got to tell you, horse thieving in these parts is really frowned on. Don't steal horses. Right? I never stole a horse. Don't you steal a horse. That darn kid, Harry Longabout, came through here in February 1887. He was leaving the Black Hills, going back to Montana to find some work. He had worked for the NN there in Montana before, but when the winter got real tough and they lost all their cattle, they sent him packing. He went to the Black Hills looking for work, and in February decided to head back to Montana, as work was pretty scarce in South Dakota. And he left the NN on good terms. Well, he didn't make it to Montana before he got himself into a heap of trouble. He was traveling across the 3V Ranch up north of here, pretty close to the Montana and South Dakota lines. He decided he needed a nice gray horse, a revolver, and a saddle belonging to Alonzo Craven, more than Mr. Craven needed it. Well, I told you horse thieving doesn't sit well around here, and it didn't take that ranch foreman any time to get down here and swear out a complaint against the young Longabout. I put the word out on telegraph as quick as I could, and lo and behold, it wasn't long until the Miles City Sheriff sent word that they had him locked up and that I should come and get him. Well, I did just that. I hopped the train and went to Miles City to get the scoundrel. He was a right personable kid, only about 19 years old, and you could tell he had some education, or at least some book learning about him. He was not hard to be around. I put hand bracelets on him and shackles, and we got on the train. Now, I had some urgent business in St. Paul, Minnesota, so we rode the train from Miles City to St. Paul on our way to Sundance. And that darn kid was pretty slick. When I was gone to relieve myself, I come back, and he was gone. That kid, I couldn't believe it. I quick had them stop the train, and we searched the train and the surrounding area real good, but there was not one sign of him. He had just disappeared. So I came back to Sundance empty-handed. It was no easy thing to tell the 3V Ranch that I had the culprit in my hands, and then he got away. Well, it wasn't but a few days, and I got another telegram from Miles City to say they had him again. Lucky for me, he pulled a dumb stunt going back to Miles City, and they promptly hauled him in. So back to Miles City I went. Now, I got to say, old Harry knew he was pretty slick and getting away, and he made no bones about telling me he would try again to escape if the chance became his. Well, long story short, I brought him back, and he was put in jail, right there in our brand spanking new jail. We're very proud. That wasn't the end of the story, though. I guess the governor decided that the kid deserved a second chance. And I'll be darned if he didn't pardon him after 18 months. Full pardon, folks. This is what I'm telling you. When he was released, he did get out of Sundance really quick. I think that's when he joined up with his other outlaw friends and became a real lawbreaker. And since we did lock him up here in Sundance, Wyoming, when he was still wet behind the ears, he earned the name the Sundance Kid. I reckon you folks should be making your way up the street with Rocky. We're right proud of our little town. We sure hope you enjoy it too.
Thanks, Sheriff.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Not yet? Okay, we're going to head on over here.
Hey, Sheriff.
Hi. Yes.
Was open. Albert Hogue was a settler that came in and saw how lush this valley was. The creek ran through the middle of it, and this is where he formed his ranch in 1875. We were still in Wyoming territory, so there were no settlements, no other settlers coming in except for people like Albert Hogue that took the chance of getting attacked by the Indians. Bears. There was a lot of bears in the bear lodge back behind us. And he did well. He did well. Through between 75 and 77, Deadwood had the big gold rush. And there was a lot of people coming through with freight wagons. And he opened up a trading post down at his little shack, little stockade down at the creek. And he did really well with it. and he ended up turning that little stockade mercantile into a mercantile, and just hit it at a good time when it needed to be here. This became one of the main thoroughfares to get to the Black Hills to Deadwood from Montana and up from Cheyenne. This was one of the main valleys they had to go through to get there. And he ended up building the first hotel right across the street here. It was the American Hotel, and it was there for about 15 years until somebody else came in and built a bigger one up on the other end of Main Street. He ended up dividing the town up into sections. There were so many people coming in that were wanting to build mercantiles, saloons, feed stores, and he said, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to make a town out of this. And his land plot even had a courthouse in it. So we weren't even we were still a territory. We're in a state yet. And he already figured out that this was going to be the county seat of the county. So he made it all planned. We have the city plans, and it tells you what saloons were where the firehouse was, where the mercantiles were, where the boot stores were, and right dead center was the courthouse square. And that sits right where it is now. Sundance got its name from the early miners that were back here in the Bear Lodge. They would watch the Native Americans at the base of the mountains do the Sundance, the ritual of a healing ritual for the Lakota at that time. And when he formed his little town, he named it after their ritual, Sundance. And it's been Sundance forever. When all these freight wagons first started coming in, he realized that they were turning around and heading back out. So when he designed town, he made our streets extra wide. So these mule teams and these oxen teams, up to 20, could turn around in our main street with no problem at all. We've kept them through the years, and right now during our motorcycle rally, the Sturgis Rally, it's filled with bikes. Sale day for the ranchers, it's filled with horse trailers and semis. So it is still used today, just like it was back in 1880. It's pretty cool. So we're going to go across the street now, at the side of the American Hotel.
Sheriff's not gonna arrest us for jaywalking.
Nope.
What?
This town is really bustling. It's really becoming a real town. Mercantiles, saloons, Chinese laundries, a little bit of everything. We even had a doctor. And I see Doc coming up the street right now. What's our luck? Hello, Doc. So come on down here further. Doc can have a seat. You probably had a hard day.
I was in a saddle, so I probably don't want to sit. How are you all?
Good, how are you?
You look healthy.
Got this rash,
You can go to my office. Everyone in every class. My name is Dr. Flora Stanton, and I am a physician. Give you a little background. I went to medical school in Boston. I lived in Pennsylvania. My husband and 3 children. And when I went to medical school, I took my daughter with me. Her name was Emma. She was tuberculous. She had tuberculosis. She really struggled on the East Coast with the weather and the humidity. And when I got out of medical school, I started looking in newspapers to see where I wanted to practice. And I found that this area was seriously in need of physicians. So I brought Emma with me. We jumped on a stage, and we came to Deadwood, South Dakota. Now, Deadwood is about 45 miles that way. And I practiced there for a little while. I'll tell you some stories about Deadwood in a minute. But the weather did not help my daughter. So I packed her up and we went to California. And I believed that weather would help her tuberculosis. It didn't. My daughter, Emma, died in California. So after we put her to rest, I had some decisions to make. And I knew I was needed in Deadwood more than anywhere else. So I came back to Deadwood to take up my practice again. Now practicing in Deadwood was pretty interesting. Deadwood was a rough coal mining town. Most of my patients had gunshot wounds. I had just retired for the evening one night. I practiced out of my home. And knock on the door. Frantic knock on the door. I got on, I put on my wrap, and I opened the door. And there stood a man who I got to know quite well over the time in Deadwood. He had a gunshot wound in his left leg. He said, "Doc, you gotta help me. And you gotta do it quick, because I gotta get out of here. They're after me." So I brought him in. The bullet had gone all the way through his thigh, so I didn't have to dig a bullet out. I stanched the bleeding, bandaged it as best I could, and he's wanting to get out of there. I bandaged him up and he went out the back door of my house. I went back. He was cleaning up the bloody mess, banging on the door, and it's the constable. He said, "Flora, I am looking for Slim." I said, "Well, Slim was here." I patched him up as best I could, but he was in a hurry. And he left about 10 minutes ago. He said, "Okay," and he took off. So I got it all done. Well, a few months later, good old Slim is back. This time he had a gunshot wound to the shoulder. That bullet didn't go all the way through. So I had to dig that bullet out. If he'd have had any teeth, he'd have been grinding them. So I got him bandaged up again and away we went. It wasn't very many months and he came back. The other leg had been shot. I dug another bullet out of him and I said, "Slim, I hope you thank the good Lord David that all these people you have a conflict with were lousy shots." He gave me a great big toothless grin and said, "Doc, I'm really grateful." But that's kind of how my time in Deadwood was. I took care of Calamity Jane a few times. She had a little problem with alcohol. I had to put stitches in her head twice because she'd fall down. But everybody loved her. She was everybody's favorite. So she'd fall down and they'd bring her to me and I'd fix her up and she'd be on her way again. Actually, Calamity had a presence here in Sundance. She was a freighter at that time. She drove a team from Deadwood and hauled freight. She came over one time on one of her trips. She put her team in the livery stable up the street. You'll see it later. And she went to the bar. There were 3 bars in town at that time. Some things don't change. But she went to the bar and they said, "Clem, your friend Joe, another freighter, died here yesterday." And it did her in. She was so distraught. And she really struggled with the demon bile. And I said, "Okay, Clem, you can hang out down at the America Hotel, which stood right here." They said it's closed, but you can stay there. They said, "We'll bring you food." She said, "I don't want food. All I want is a gallon of beer a day." And they brought her a gallon of beer a day. She was here for 3 days. She put her life back together, sort of. So she went and got her team and went back to Deadwood. She had a presence here more than once. They were brief stays, but she was very colorful. And I didn't see her often, but most of I'm sure you're wondering about my attire. I do know how to dress properly for the 1890s, but my work doesn't afford me that. I left town. I'll tell you how I got to Sundance. I was practicing in Deadwood, and there was a Dr. Baker that lived here, and he was completely overwhelmed. So he came to Deadwood and said, can you just practice in Sundance 2 or 3 days a week? I said, okay. So I ride my big bay gelding from Deadwood to Sundance. It's a lot faster than the stage. So I ride my gelding here, and I stay for 3 days. I rented a house up here on North Street, had my office in it. Now the interesting about doctoring was we didn't have a lot of people that came to our office. We did a lot of house calls, if you will. And many of them were out in the country. They were quite a ways. That's why Doc Baker needed help, because he couldn't do all of the remote doctoring and continue his practice here. And we took turns. There were some days that I would be in the office and he would be all over this great country. And other times he was in the office and I was there. That's why I'm dressed the way I am. I just got back to town. I just put my old tuck up in the livery and went over here and delivered a baby. And now I'm hopefully done. Now, this was the end of 3 days that were pretty tedious. I had gotten a message. The way messages worked was somebody wrote to my office and said, Mrs. Huckins is having a hard time birthing her 4th child. Can you come and help? So I got on my horse and I went. She'd been laboring for several days. And by morning, we had a healthy baby. I was happy I got there when I did. They both lived. And I got them taken care of. I went out to get on my horse, and here comes the Putnam young man, and he said, Doc, you gotta come with me. My dad has got terrible stomach pains. His belly hurts bad. Can you come? Yes, I can. So I went to the Putnams, and he was in a lot of pain, abdominal pain. So after a quick examination, I decided that it must be an appendicitis. You know, there was no operating parlors in those days. So I was happy that the Putnams had a lot of children because they had a big dining room table. So I put a sterile sheet on that table. I carry this bag. This hooks over my saddle horn, right along next to the scabbard with my rifle in it, and that's how I travel these parts. I had a sterile sheet, put it down. I had one of the Putnam kids help me by putting the ether-soaked cloth over his face, and he went out like an extinguished lamp. So I opened him up, and yes, indeed, that appendix was terrible, inflamed, red, and angry looking. I took it out, I sewed him back up, we took the ether off his face, and he came around just fine. He didn't feel real good, but he came around. So I thought, okay, I instructed Mrs. Putnam how to take care of him. And I thought, I went out and got my horse. Here comes the Wilsey boy. He said, my older brother broke his leg and it's bad. It's a bad break. Okay, well, it was only about 4 miles to their house, and I was grateful for that. So I rode over there, and it was a bad break. In my trusty bag here, I carry as much as I can. I had splints and rags. I had to set his leg, and I splinted it and used the rags to wrap the splints on. Told him how to take care of him. And I got on my horse that time in a big hurry because I planned on getting out of there before I got stopped. So that was about 2 days worth. And I got back, and as I was putting my horse up, found out that this lady over here was needing some help. So I went and birthed her baby. There was a lot of difficult things, but there was no place nicer than Sundance. And so I decided, oftentimes in those days, people didn't have any money, and they would pay with animals. So I ended up with about 6 chickens, a pig, and 2 cows. So I decided I better file a claim on a homestead, and I did, east of town. Some of the neighbors were kind enough to help me build a shack. We put up a lean-to barn, and that's where my critters reside. That's where I reside when I'm here. But that's kind of the way medicine is in the 1890s. But I suppose I should go and get my horse and head on home. I'm happy to see all of you. If you have any questions, maybe I can answer. Yes. Yes.
How did people react to you as a woman doctor in that time period?
Not well. I had when I went to Deadwood, it was really difficult there. In the Deadwood Museum, there's a large history of me. But it took some people. The men really struggled with having me treat them. I understood that because I was a rare breed in those days. But word spreads, as you said. They learned to trust me, and it went well. Anything else?
Yeah, that Doc Baker, did he happen to be from Minnesota, like Walnut Grove?
I want to know if they made the TV program Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman.
There you go.
I don't think that was made. I don't think that was made after me. I don't know.
I thought it was Michael Landon.
Well, there's not a lot of. There's not. I understand Michael Landon. I don't. There's not a lot of history on Doc Baker, and actually, he didn't live to be an old man. He died here in Sundance.
Is he buried here in the cemetery?
No, he's not. I don't know where. I don't know what cemetery.
On this street.
Uh-oh.
Okay. All right.
Cemetery crawl.
There is our city park over here. Sorry, I just dropped out of character there. It's named after a doctor that was here for many, many years. His name was Dr. Campbell. And that city park is named after him. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
There's another.
Oh, another question.
What year did you graduate from college?
I got out of med school in 1890.
Wow.
How many women were in your class?
So that's when I came here. And the husband I told you I had, he wasn't real fond of the idea that his wife was a physician. He really wasn't fond of the fact that I came here. And I wasn't real fond of the fact that he didn't want me to be a physician. I never saw him again.
Good for you and yours again.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Rocky's going to take you the rest of the way.
Have a good night, Doctor. Okay, we're going to continue with the street now. The town to be in. Deadwood was big, but it was also a ruckus town. We had a town for families. We had a town, there were 3 different churches in town. There was our sheriff. There was our city policeman. We had 3 Chinese laundries in town. And one Chinese laundry was back here in this back alley. They weren't here very long. They came out of Deadwood. And Charlie Ho was the one that had his little shack here. There was a group of guys in town that didn't like him. And they tried their darndest to keep him out. The other 2 gentlemen, within, I think about 3 weeks, I think there were 3 weeks of newspapers that told about what they did to those poor Chinese men. And they ended up going back to Deadwood. Charlie stuck it out for another month, but they would claim that he was being violent. What they would do, they would harass him. And he was either chopping wood or something, he'd come at him with the axe, and they said, okay, we got you now. You came at me with this axe. They would pour alcohol on him and then beat him up and throw him in the middle of the street. So they would think that he was just got into a fight and he just, fell down in the street and hurt himself. What they ended up doing to get Charlie out of town, they contacted the Denver Sanitarium and said, we've got a crazy Chinese man up here that we're afraid is going to do harm to our community. You got to come up and take him away. They came up, put him in a straitjacket, and took him back, and we never heard from Charlie Ho again. So, you know, it was our little utopia in our little eyes here, but there were bad parts of it. There were times where the Native Americans were sent to the reservations and they weren't allowed here, but there were still bands that were still wanting to hunt buffalo up in Montana and in the Black Hills. And there were articles in our papers stating that there's a band of heathen Indians on the east side of town, do not go there. A week later, there was another article in the town stating that, remember those heathen Indians? They were starving. They needed our help. They needed food. They needed blankets. You know, and so, you know, this town had the good people. They had the bad, like every other town. But it was a good, rounded town. We had black cowboys here. We had black homesteaders. So it was a nice community. People came out here wanting to start over, and they could. A lot of them changed their names. A lot of them were bad guys that came out and changed their names. It was a wild place. You never knew who you were going to run into. There's stories of outlaws back here in the Bear Lodge that would just go around killing people. They didn't know why. They just enjoyed it. Homesteaders. A lot of homesteaders lost their homesteads because somebody else wanted their property. And out here, you were by yourselves, and if you knocked one off, they'd throw them in a ditch. Nobody'd ever find him. In the 20s, when they opened up the Homestead Act again for settlers, people were finding bodies out in these places that they didn't know who they were. They would just say another body was found, you know, in this section, and you know, at that time they didn't know, they didn't have any way to find out who it was. So it's crazy how wild it was out here, but at the same time, it was our utopia. You know, it was such a beautiful place. The weather is gorgeous. Settlers were coming in like crazy. There were farmers, ranchers. They just really grew too fast, I think. And it went to a point, and we stopped. Like, you know, it got to 500 people in the 1890s, and then it's taken us forever to get to 1,200. You know, we hit probably 1,200 in 1950. And it has not grown since 1950. So it is a crazy little area. And the surrounding area, a lot of the little homesteads have been bought up by the big ranchers, and now they're getting resold again. The big ranchers are splitting them up, and these little homesteads are forming again, just like it was back in the early 1900s. So it's doing a big circle, just like it's going to happen all over again. Hopefully a little tamer now. So we're going to continue on up. We had 3 newspapers in Sundance alone. We had the Sundance Gazette, Crook County Monitor, and the Sundance Times. The Sundance Times is right up here, and it is in the spot that the Sundance Gazette was from 1884. The Monitor was further up on Main Street. And then every other little community, what the homesteaders had to do, they had to go register their property in a newspaper so they have proof that it was theirs. So every little town, every little community had their own newspaper. So they didn't have to travel 60, 70 miles into town to stake claim on their property. So like Colony, which is up by the Montana border by Belfouche, they had the Colony Coyote. Lightning Flats Flash was almost right up in Montana, way up north here. It was just the little names, I got them in my museum, which you can't see. I hate even bringing that up. But yeah, it was very important to have your name and your property coordinates in that paper so nobody could come and steal it. We're going to walk up here in the corner. On the corner here is the Sundance State Bank. It's the second oldest bank in the state of Wyoming. It was formed in 1895. And the brick building, the big stone building here, was built in 1914. In 1913, they had a fire and it burnt the original one down, so they rebuilt it in the stone. The sandstone came out of the Bear Lodge Mountains here, and it's such a fine quality that they took it to the Chicago World's Fair for a sample of sandstone. During the Depression, Sundance State Bank was one of the strongest banks in the country. And instead of letting Moorcroft and Hewlett banks go bankrupt, they incorporated them into the Sundance State Bank, so nobody lost loans, nobody lost properties. And then after the Depression, they released them and they opened up their banks again. So it's been a good bank. It's still in business. It's up here on the corner now, where the old livery stable was. And we have the 1914 on this side, and then the 1895 on this side for when it was established. It is. The owner passed away here 3-4 years ago from cancer. It was her granddad that did the bank, and she came back. She had big plans for it, and she died. So we don't know what's happening to it right now. Yeah. She had plans for it. And I didn't, because they were in the bank. And they're Canadian.
We gotta learn them down.
Oh, I know. I wish he'd give it up. On this corner was one of our first mercantiles. It was called the Red Front Store. It had a barber shop in the back. It had a land office, so you can get your land deeds here. It had ladders, it had paint, it had wallpaper, everything for your homestead right here. And when it closed, the little barber shop ended up moving up on the corner over here. So it was a barber shop until about 1980. So you're walking up here. And like I said, they really wanted Sundance to be the place to come. So education was a large part of this community. We had a beautiful school up on the hill over here that was known for teaching. So we're going to talk to one of our first school teachers. Come on, join around her.
I'll wait till all my students are.
Yes.
Come in, line up in rows.
I was hoping you made more copies of your test.
I don't know if I've got enough.
I meant to text
Oh, you shouldn't have said anything about it. Well, good evening. You all must be my new students. I'm very happy to see all of you. My name is Cleo Pearl Richardson, and I'd like to welcome you to my classroom here at Sundance Primary School. Now, I'd like to give you a little bit of information about myself. I was the first white girl born in Crook County, Wyoming, on March 18th, 1884, 9 miles north of here in Government Valley. I started my normal school training in Spearfish, South Dakota in 1903, and I received my first grade teaching certificate in 1905. I have taught in 5 different country schools in Cook County, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about this experience. Now, the length of the school year is never something you could be sure of. It's usually determined by the parents of the students that come each year. It can vary anywhere from 3 to 7 months, depending on the children. The students and I always ride our horses to school, and we tie them in a lean-to shed alongside the school building. I bring a skirt or have a skirt that I keep at school so I can change from my riding breeches and be presentable when my students arrive. Now, since I am not only the teacher, I am also the janitor and the fire starter as well. So I have to arrive early in the morning to start a fire in that pot-bellied stove so the classroom is warm when my students arrive a little bit later on. We go to school pretty much the same as you guys go to school, from 9 a.m. in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. We have 2 15-minute recesses and an hour for lunch. Now, I never know how many students I'm going to have until the school year actually begins, and I also don't know what grades they're going to be in. Most of the school year starts in August and goes through March, But in some of the areas where the snow gets really, really deep, they will start in April and go through October. Now, most of the rural schoolhouses are very similar. They are small log buildings with large windows on the south for light and a blackboard on the opposite side for students to do their lessons on. The only other structures are in the schoolyard. These are the necessity stations. The smaller schools usually have one for both boys and girls, but the larger schools, like the Sundance Primary School, has two. And I'll let you decide which is for boys and which is for girls. As I said, I never know what level of students I will have until the school year starts. But we always start our school day the same way. We stand by our desks, we say the Pledge of Allegiance, and we sing the Star-Spangled Banner. Classes, I prefer to have spelling first, then social studies, poetry studies, math, history, grammar, reading, and on Saturdays we work on our art projects. Now during the recesses and lunch breaks, the students go in the yard and play games like Annie Over, Red Light, Green Light, Red Rover. In the wintertime, when it's too cold to go outside and play, the older students and I take turns reading stories. I'm particularly fond of Robinson Crusoe. Now, many of the country schools do not have water, so I have to haul water on my horse every day for my students. In the wintertime, we can melt snow to wash our hands and faces, but water has to be hauled. At one of the country schools I taught at, I had one young student, but the rest of them were all older boys. And at that school, we decided during recesses and lunch breaks, we would see if we could dig a well. We hit water. And some of the fathers came in and tasted, and at that particular school, I never had to haul water again, and I was very thankful. Now, Christmas programs in the rural schools are very, very special. We usually have a play of the story of Christmas. Some of the students read poetry appropriate for the season. And we decorate the school with strings of popcorn and ornaments that the students have made in art class. Now, at the end of the school year, do you guys have a picnic? When your school year is over with, do you have a picnic and everybody gets together? Oh, you're missing out on some fun. At the end of the school year, we usually have a big picnic, and sometimes all the rural schools would get together at Devil's Tower. And they would run races, pitch horseshoes, and usually have a rousing game of baseball. In 1908, I got a teaching position here at Sundance Primary School. This school used to sit up at the base of Sundance Mountain. Rocky can give you the dates. I started teaching there in 1908, and I think that was the year it was built.
That's the year it was built,
Yes.
and until 1920, it was in use. And then in 1920, they said when the wind blew, it swayed like a ship. And they decided to build the old stone schoolhouse, and the first graduating class was in 1924 from it.
That's where the original old school was. And this is a picture of the original old school. You can see it has 2 floors, nice big windows, 2 necessity stations. Yeah, come around so you can see it. And the bell tower, and we're still looking for that bell. But there was a flagpole. You can see how decorative and fancy a lot of this was. Also, you'll notice there are no trees. This was way early on. But that was the old primary school. Now, that's where I got a teaching position when it opened. I had, at that time, between 40 and 50 students that I taught, but it was still much less work than the country schools because I didn't have to haul water, I didn't have to ride my horse back and forth to work and things like that. If there was not a rural school close to the ranch where the children and their parents lived, one of the parents, usually the mother, would come into town, would rent a room during the school year and stay with the children, probably go home on weekends. Some of the children also boarded with people here in town while they were going to school. Now, while teaching in the rural schools, I made $45 a month. 5 of which I had to give to the family that I was boarding with. Now, when I went to work teaching at the Sundance primary school, I got $55 a month. So, yes, that was quite an upgrade. Now, it appears to be that most of you will be testing testing to see if you will be going on to high school from 8th grade. So I'm going to give you a preview of what to expect on your 8th grade tests. Now, as Rocky will tell you, this is quite a test, and you have to get it 100% correct to carry on. So I'm going to pass out these. I'm sorry, I didn't.
I'm in 8th grade forever. A curfew bell. So when the boarding houses were in, right across where the Longhorn Bar is, was a little cafe. And upstairs, there were 6 rooms that they had boarding in for boys. And there was another house up here. The green one was a boarding house. So we had quite a few little boarding houses here in town. There was one night that the boys thought it'd be funny. They got their 22s out, and after curfew, they kept pinging the bell. And it drove the police crazy. They never did find out who it was. I found out last year that it was Chipper Chatfield. He's one of our local cowboys here in town. Yeah, 80, what is he, 90, 95 now? So, yeah, so it's Chipper that was pinging the bell after 10 o'clock. So we're going to go up here. There's also about 4 mercantiles here in town. Old Abe Frank had the first mercantile that's situated here. And he was a very wealthy man. He had a mercantile here, and his brother had a mercantile in Newcastle. He had the first telephone in town here was in the back of his mercantile. This mercantile did burn down around 1895. This one burnt down, and he built it across the street, rebuilt it over there, about where the mortuary is now. This is one of the original buildings from here in town. This was part of the little red front store where the barber was. And then when they built the new Tri-County building, they moved it up here, and it was a barber shop up here until about 1980. This was another little cafe that understood tourism in 1890. In 1890, there was a lot of people that were going to Yellowstone Park. They were going down to see the Tetons, and they'd get in their wagons and make a 2-week trip out of it. And there was a newlywed in town here. Him and his wife and another couple wanted to go to Yellowstone Park, so they stopped here. And this little place would sell little boxes with a sandwich and a jar of water. So you'd have a little lunch to go. And they didn't get too far. They just got on the other side of Gillette, got in middle of a dispute between 2 outlaws, and the gentleman passed away. They continued on to Yellowstone Park without him. They buried him over Gillette and just moved on to Yellowstone Park, and the wife was a widower. So nothing stopped them when they started going. They had it planned out for 2 weeks, and they kept on going. Across the street, where the post office is now, was the Sundance Hotel. After the American closed down, Sundance Hotel opened up, and it was the fanciest place in the region. They had carpeted floors. They had stoves in every room, which was a fall for them because that's where the fires came from. That poor building had 3 nasty fires in it, and the third one, it was in 1930, and it was a old folks home at that time. Nobody was injured, but it did completely burn the building down in 1930. So, but it was right in the heart of the Wild West. It had the livery stable across the street. They really understood the stagecoach. The stagecoach would be the main stop here. They would have a full menu in the paper every week. They would have fresh oysters, duck à l'orange, all these fancy city food. And I like to know where they got the fresh oysters. That always scared me.
Sure they weren't Rocky Mountain.
Yeah, no, not at that time they weren't. They were fresh oysters. But they really pushed their, the other places, if you didn't have shoes, you could walk in. This place, you had to have your shoes. You had to be dressed properly to go into the Zane Hotel. So we're going to cross the street. This is one of our first livery stables. The Bartons built it, and it was a livery stable until 1920. Getting used walking backwards. Looks like old Mr. Barton is gone today, but his wife May is here. That happens a lot. You know, the women were just as strong as the men out here. You know, the men would have to go out, fix the wagons. The women would stay here and do stuff that had to be done. That they had to. Even if there were Indian raids, they all knew how to shoot. They all knew, you know, what they had to do to survive out here in the West. Hi, May.
Good evening. I am May Barton, and my husband George owns this livery stable. We've been here several years now, but George isn't here tonight. He had to go out on Bear Lodge Road and help a fellow has a broken down wagon. He took our little wagon and some tools and some wire and hopes to put a quick fix on that wagon so we can get it back in here where the forge is and fix the wheel the way it's supposed to be fixed. George is pretty good at fixing buggies and wagons and such. I'll tell you a little bit about our business. We think the livery stable is a pretty good way to make a living. Everybody needs a livery. Now and then, people come to town and leave their horses here. Many folks in the area live as much as a day's ride out of town. So when they want to come to town for supplies, they plan to spend the night and go home the next day. So they leave their horses with us, and we feed them and water them and keep them comfortable. And the next morning, the horses are fresh when they're ready to go home. And we have a spot out back where they can park their wagons while they're here. Sorry, first night back. Most of the time, but the stage brings us some business, and George trims horses' hooves for people that don't want to do it or can't do it themselves. So that's how we make a living. Even Doc Stafford leaves her horse with us sometimes when she comes to town. Usually when she comes to town, because you know she has a medical practice in Deadwood as well as here in Sundance. So when she comes here, she doesn't have a place to leave her horse. So he gets to stay with us until she needs to ride out into the county to visit a patient or when she's ready to go back to Deadwood. Then he's here waiting for her, ready to go. Most of the time, you know, it's a pretty good living. But sometimes it gets slow. And you know, butter's 18 cents a pound, and so is coffee. We don't have a place to keep a cow here, so we have to buy our butter and our milk and our cream. But out back we have a little spot where we keep some chickens, so we have plenty of fresh eggs and sometimes some fresh chickens to eat. In the winter, things do slow down, but George and some of the other fellows go out to the lake out here and they cut ice. They bring those blocks of ice back into town and store them in John Bauer's ice house. He has 3 feet of sawdust in that ice house, so they bury those blocks of ice, and they'll actually stay frozen until into the early part of the summer. We think Sundance is a pretty nice place to live. We don't have much trouble with Indians anymore, and the law doesn't allow any gunplay in the street, so it's pretty quiet. Well, I hate to leave good company, but I need to go out and check and gather the eggs and lock the chickens in, otherwise the darn varmints will eat them. So you folks have safe travels, and if you need somebody to look after your horses, remember the Barton Livery Stable.
Thanks, May. The livery stable was in business until the early 1900s, and then in 1920, the Tracy family came in and turned it into a Studebaker business. So they sold Studebakers and farm implements also until 1970, 78, 79, somewhere. Yeah, 75. So yeah, it's been a livery stable forever in this spot here. And the big door used to face north, and the Sundance Creek used to be above ground through here. And they said during the spring that it would clean the livery stable out every spring, so they wouldn't have to after a long winter.
Right, for you, that's
Yeah, yeah, good for them, bad for them.
And they rechanneled the river.
They put it underground. Yeah, so things have come down with moisture. We're across the street now. Was just to the south of it, and when we got electricity here in town, they built this new one. So it's an electric stone right there, flower. No. I know. Yeah. So, Sheriff's here to refill your drinks.
More tasty beverage.
So tell him what you want, and he will give it to you.
Did the sheriff set us up?
I can get a real cold one.
Okay.
They do keep it cold.
Everybody's good. So the building that we're standing in front of was one of another mercantile here in town, and it was the Rounds Mercantile. The Rounds would always try to get a partner to come in with them and work with them. And one of the partners that they ended up at the very end was Seth Bullock and Saul Starr out of Deadwood. Seth Bullock saw how Sundance was growing. He wanted a mercantile here in town to go with his one in Spearfish in Deadwood. And he made a deal with Mr. Rounds, and they were in business for 8 years together here. On the 8th year, it burnt down. Sundance had a real problem of building their buildings close together, common walls, so if one building got caught on fire, it would take the whole block. So that's why all our buildings are pretty well new in town, because all the historic buildings have been burnt down. So when Seth Bullock noticed that he heard about the store being burnt down, he came and rebuilt it from Mr. Rounds. But he never came back to town. He ended up focusing on his store in Spearfish and stayed there, and then he had a ranch over in Belfouche that he stayed at. So at this, the Rounds has had this mercantile for years afterwards. And then next to it was another mercantile, or a saloon, that Charlie Sackett owned. So we're going to walk on down here. Yeah.
Now, at one time, wasn't this Sheldorf's grain?
It was not Sheldorf's.
It wasn't Sheldorf's.
It was Robert's flour mill, and then they had a appliance store up front.
Is that good, huh?
And like May was talking about how the ice houses were, used here in town. There were 3 ice houses in town here. And there was a small little dam up against Sundance Mountain that had spring water. Beautiful, ice cold, mineral, just beautiful water up there. And they would cut the ice from there. But there's also a little lake on the west end of town here that has sulfur in it. So it's a free-flowing sulfur spring out there. And the bars would get their ice from that. And they said it really smoothed out the whiskeys, that sulfury ice. So they would always sell that ice to the bars and then that one to the homes and the businesses. So I haven't tried it yet. I keep saying I'm going to try that ice just to see. And this is where Abe Frank ended up moving it from across the street to here for his mercantile. And this is where the first phone line. And next to it, where Rounds had it, was also the first telegraph. That is one of the reasons that Sundance got the telegraph, because Seth Bullock wanted to communicate between Deadwood and Spearfish and here for his freight and for just keeping the mix of everything. So without Seth Bullock, we wouldn't have had the information center that we ended up having. So this street in the 1880s had 2 saloons, and this was a little cafe, and next to it was Charlie Sackett's saloon, one of the 4 that he had here in town. And Charlie Sackett, he knew what he was doing. He would build it, get it established, sell it, build another one. It was 2 weeks before Prohibition. He sold his last saloon and opened up a gas station on the corner down where the American Hotel was. 2 weeks before Prohibition. In around 1925, we have a receipt from the Masons here in town from Charlie Sackett that Charlie Sackett sold him a gallon of gas or a case of gasoline for one of their parties. So he was still using his liquor that he had in the saloon, but since he didn't have a liquor license, he had to state that it was gasoline in this case. So we have a great little receipt from that. And Masons are still finding information about, townspeople forming. They have everything from the 1880s when they first established here in town. They've kept all their records. And it's a mess right now, but there's a historian that is just starting to go through it, and he's doing a great job. This place here was a millinery. It was a hat maker. So she would make hats for all the little ladies here in town. Her husband passed away when he was 50 from an infected tooth. So her little hat, he was a lawyer also, so they were pretty well off. After he passed away, she needed to make more money. So she started selling her big hats, expensive hats, to the whorehouses, cat houses in Gillette and Deadwood. And nobody knew in town. It was a family secret until 2 years ago. When the great-great-grandson told me. He says, this is going to be a family secret. He said, this is how Grandma survived. And she wouldn't have been able to do it without that. But the family has kept it a secret from everybody until now. Now I'm telling the world.
So much for the family.
I know.
That's amazing.
It is crazy, yeah. Yeah, because... Yeah.
You could have pulled out of the bag.
Exactly. But, the Hoopers are a 5th generation now. They still live here in town.
Wow.
And it's just amazing. We have a picture of little Les Hooper in front of the Nettlehorst Pharmacy. Him and 6 other kids on sleighs, getting pulled by a poor little donkey. And it just looks like a wild bunch of kids. It's just crazy.
Wow.
And he was also the one that tied Calamity's shoes when she was crossing the street. She just bought a bunch of gifts. She was crossing the street, and her shoe came untied. She asked little Les to come and tie her shoe for her so she wouldn't trip. So, Calamity really had the soft spot, but when she had liquor in her, she was loud, noisy. The mothers would take their kids with their hands over the ears and escort them into a building because she was swearing at her horses so bad going down to the creek to water them. But then she would get dressed up when she was sober and be a pretty normal person here in town. So it's Calamity did have her good points and her bad points. So we're going to cross the street now. 3rd Street was also quite a booming little street at the time. They had a boot shop on that end. They had a grocery store. And that little grocery store, the Partlow Market, they used to get, at the time, they could go and there was a farm down at Buckhorn, which is one of the highest spots south of us in the mountains by O'Neill Pass. They used to grow watermelons, cantaloupes, cauliflower, and broccoli down there. How? We don't know. But they would put ads in the paper stating that this farm just brought in fresh produce from Buckhorn. And it's like, how did they do that? We can't grow watermelon here in town now because our season is so short. So 100 years ago, our seasons must have been a little different than what they are now. Yeah. So now we're going to meet one of Sundance's notorious outlaws. So ladies, watch your purses and hang on to your wallets. He is White the Talker. Don't look him in the eye. Well, hey Harry, how you doing tonight? Howdy. Gather around. Let him tell you a story.
Howdy, folks. I'm Harry Longbaugh. Glad to see you stop at Sundance. Probably not for the same reasons I did, but nonetheless, I'm glad you're here. Well, I was born and raised in Pennsylvania, and my grandparents were German immigrants over here. My mom, she was a pretty hard-working, determined woman. Did everything she could to make ends meet. Old Pa, he was kind of a no-count, no-show. He wasn't really around much. So when I was about 14 years old, I decided I was going to head out on my own, and times were pretty tough back then. So me and my brother, we saved up what money we could, and we bought train tickets and we headed on out to Colorado. We had a cousin named George that lived down there, and he had a homestead near Cortez. They had a big horse ranch, so it was a pretty good place to go. Because to be honest with you, I think I got along with horses probably a little better than I did people. So we hopped on a train and headed out that way. Well, we were down there for a couple of years, kind of helping them out, doing pretty well. But as I got a little older, I decided I wanted to kind of venture out, see what things were like up this way. Well, I left Colorado and I made it about as far as Lusk, Wyoming, which is about 120 miles south of here. And there was a ranch down there. They were looking for a lot of cowboys, you know, looking for rustlers and whatnot. Well, I thought it was a good place, so I stopped there and they put me to work. Well, it kind of rubbed me the wrong way and I started getting into fights. Wasn't doing too well. Well, the sheriff down there, he came looking for me one day. He claimed I had stole $80 from some old man there in town. Well, I wasn't going to stick around long enough to let him prove whether I was guilty or not, so I hightailed it out of Lusk and headed this way. And during the time I was actually heading up to Miles City, Montana, but I passed through the Sundance area here and I seemed to really like it. But there was a big outfit up there at the time called the Bar Inn Ranch. And they were a really big cattle outfit at the time. And they had hundreds of thousands of head that went from Montana all the way to Colorado. They were a pretty good sized outfit, so they put me and a bunch of cowboys to work. Well, it wasn't too long after that, the winter of 1886 came along. It was a pretty tough winter, and they figured they lost about half their herd that year. Needless to say, that gave me and a bunch of the boys our walking papers. We were out of jobs. Well, I figured I'd kind of head back to the Black Hills here. I came back to the Sundance area here. I started looking for work. Well, it was a pretty rough winter still, so I could barely keep a roof over my head or even keep myself fed. I had left that Bar Inn Ranch up in Miles City on pretty good terms, so I figured I'd go ahead and head back and see if they just put me to work. I left Sundance and I was a little ways north of town here, a little place called Courchaine. Passing by a ranch up there, and I could see a rancher out in the field a little ways. And, well, he was a ways from his horse. And it was this real nice gray gelding, and it had a saddle, and well, it had a few hog legs on it too. And I figured I could use those a little more than he could at the time, so I bailed on his horse, and back to Miles City, Montana I went. That old rancher, though, he was pretty upset with me. He had a pretty good description of the horse and the weapons. And kind of a good description of me too. And he came down here and met up with Sheriff Ryan. I'm sure you guys met him earlier. I don't think he's much of a lawman myself, but that's my opinion. Well, he sent out a telegraph throughout the area, and it didn't take him too long to match a description of me up in Miles City, so they sent Sheriff Ryan up to come get me. Well, he got up there, and it didn't take him too long. They had me locked up, so Sheriff Ryan was going to go ahead and bring me back to Crook County here. We hopped on a train and started heading this way. Well, we started heading a little further east than I thought we probably should. I think he must have had some funny business going on out in Minnesota. We ended up quite a ways out there, and I was getting pretty sick and tired of being shackled and cuffed in that train, so he got up to go and relieve himself, and I figured that was a damn good time to slip those cuffs and jump off the train. They stopped it, and they searched high and low. They looked everywhere, and they couldn't find me, but I wasn't a real smart kid either, because I stole another horse and a couple more guns, and I headed straight back to Miles City, Montana. And they knew who I was when I got back there. Didn't take them long. They had me locked up again. And they sent Sheriff Ryan up to come get me a second time. They had me in there for almost 18 months. About the day before I was to be released, the governor at the time, his name was Governor Moonlight, he gave me a full pardon, let me go a free man. Well, Sheriff Ryan was pretty upset about that, but he didn't have much to say, so. They cut me loose, and as soon as I got out of here, I met up with Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch. We started raising hell all over the area here. And those boys never let me live it down, though, that I had served my first time here in Sundance. And the name the Sundance Kid just kind of stuck with me throughout the rest of my career. Well, I guess the rest is history. Thanks, guys.
Any questions for Harry? You can get pictures taken with him. Just watch your purses and wallet. You don't trust him. Thank you. Thanks for coming, guys. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for deciding to do it free.
Oh, cotton. Starting cottonwood trees in town are terrible.
No, it's July snow.
Yeah.
You did a good job.
Thanks.
Wind blows it over everything. So that one I'm going to
Except for the trucks.
Harry.
You are the what?
You gotta come downtown to understand, right?
Yeah.
I'll tell them, you gotta come with me to understand where I'm going.
Talk about
Yeah.
You guys have a good evening.
Yeah, you too.
One and put it on the corner here, maybe. I don't know. So that's what we're going to start. Go pick signs and say, okay.
It's a small town. I think they wouldn't mind. Ah, that was awesome. Well, thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rocky.
Yeah,
Yes.
enjoy it.